Hebrews 11 continues by going over a number of the heroes of the faith, or those who had enduring faith. Because remember, we have been exhorted in Hebrews to maintain our faith, to not fall back, but to grow in faith. And in Hebrews 11, of course, it's giving us a number of examples from the Old Testament of people who did, in fact, have enduring faith, even though they never received the promises, and even though many of them had to endure incredible hardship, yet they maintained their faith. So I think what I'm going to do here is probably use 2 lectures to complete Hebrews 11, and then conclude the second lecture with the very beginning of Hebrews chapter 12, since it follows from and sort of concludes what Hebrews 11 has been saying. In this lecture, we will look at Abraham and Moses, and then we'll also be looking at the events Rahab just before Israel entered the land. So we begin in verse 17 through verse 22, which says this: By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, In Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people from the dead, from which he also received him, referring to Isaac, back as a type. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel, and gave orders concerning his bones. Now, you'll recall, as we discussed in the last lecture, Abraham was also mentioned earlier and was commended for his having obeyed God in leaving his home in Mesopotamia and going to a country that God would show him. Now, Abraham's faith is being commended in his willingness to offer up his son Isaac to God as a sacrifice, as recounted in Genesis chapter 22. Now, here in verse 17, it says that Abraham offered up Isaac. The word offered is in the perfect tense, and this shows that God reckoned his faith as his act and imputed the result to him, even though he had, as though he had completed it. The same is found in the account of this event in Genesis 22, verse 16, where God says, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. Again, God regarded Abraham as actually having done the act of sacrifice. Now, since verse 17 says that Abraham offered up Isaac by faith, this is showing that obedience demonstrates our faith. Or to put it another way, the failure to obey demonstrates a lack of faith. And so once again, it goes back to Ephesians 2, verses 8, 9, and 10. For by grace you've been saved through faith, not of works, that not of yourself. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. So we're saved only by faith. But Ephesians 2, verse 10 goes on to say, For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So in other words, it is what we do after professing faith, our life, our acts, our deeds, that demonstrate whether the faith we have or that we profess is true or false faith. Now, in Genesis 22, verse 5, after God told Abraham to go to the land of Moriah to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham told the young men who were with him, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. So ultimately, what this is showing is that our obedience is an act of worship of God. And interestingly, the second half of verse 17 in Hebrews 11 uses the imperfect tense. It says this, that the first half of verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. But the second half of verse 17 says, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Now, the imperfect tense is used to show that the act of offering was not completed because God stopped its consummation. Now, in this offering up of Isaac, Christ is prefigured. His crucifixion is prefigured. And that's probably another reason why the perfect tense was used in Genesis 22:16 and the beginning of Hebrews 11:17. In other words, Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac in the land of Moriah. That is where Jerusalem and the temple were located and where Jesus was crucified. Just as Abraham showed his love for God by his willingness to offer his son, so God the Father showed his love for the world by actually offering up his son for our sin. And just as the wood to burn the sacrifice was laid on Isaac, according to Genesis 22, so Jesus had to carry the cross on which he was nailed. Just as Abraham said that God will provide for himself the lamb for the sacrifice, so God provided Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And just as Isaac was obedient to the will of his father, even to the point of death, so Jesus was obedient to the will of his Father all the way through death. In other words, Isaac was obedient at the risk of his life. Jesus was obedient at the cost of his life. And just as Abraham would have considered Isaac dead for the 3 days of their journey to Mount Moriah, Jesus Christ himself was in the grave for 3 days. And finally, just as Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead and received him back as a type, Jesus literally was resurrected from the dead. Now, in verses 20 through 22, those verses give a short account of how by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, and Jacob blessed Ephraim and Manasseh and worshipped, and Joseph mentioned the exodus of Israel from Egypt and gave orders concerning his bones. Now, in each of these cases, their faith looked beyond death. Each one was confident that God would carry out his will even after they themselves were dead. But the fulfillment of God's will could only be known through faith. Now, at first, it might seem strange that those particular acts were included in the Hebrews 11 list of faithful acts. But, for example, the account of Isaac's blessing Jacob and Esau is found in Genesis 27. Now, you may recall, Jacob connived with his mother and pretended to be Esau, seeking to get favoritism through an act of the flesh and lying to his father. But the fact is that Isaac blessed Jacob by faith. And by blessing Jacob by faith, that indicates that despite Jacob's deception, Isaac must have discerned his true identity before he bestowed the blessing. His blessing on Jacob was in accordance with God's will, since the Lord had decreed before both Jacob and Esau were born that the older, Esau, would serve the younger, Jacob. And now, of course, when Esau learned of the blessing of Isaac and Jacob's deception, although he cried out a bitter cry, he could not change Isaac's mind or the blessing that he had given to Isaac, or that he had given to Jacob. Isaac did, in fact, bless Esau, but in accordance with what the Lord had said before the two boys were born, the main blessing went to Jacob. And so here, by the faith of Isaac, involved counteracting the will of the flesh, the deception of Jacob, in attempting to obtain something which Jacob was not entitled to. But Jacob's blessing Ephraim and Manasseh is stated in Hebrews 11, verse 21. That blessing is found in Genesis 48. And the account of Jacob's worshiping is found in Genesis 47, verse 31. Now, as you may know, in the ancient Near East, the older son typically was favored over the younger son. And that is why when Jacob blessed Joseph's sons, Joseph wanted Jacob to bless Manasseh, the older son, with his right hand, and Ephraim, the younger son, with his left hand. But Jacob did it the other way around. In this case, God was overriding a man-made custom or involving the will of man, a man-made system of favoritism which God overrode for his own purposes. Now, then, Hebrews 11, verse 22 concludes by saying, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Now, again, it might sound a little odd to us that this is the one thing from Joseph's life where his faith is commended. When you look at the amazingly eventful life that Joseph had, God sending him dreams as a youth, being sold into slavery, his interpreting dreams, his rising to power in Egypt and saving thousands from starvation. And God was obviously orchestrating the events of Joseph's life, but none of that is mentioned. Only, mentioned is concerning bringing his bones back, from Egypt at the time of the Exodus. Now, and this, in other words, since this was done by faith, that has to indicate that God spoke, Joseph heard, and by faith told what God had said. Joseph's faith was based on his knowledge of and trust in what God had said. In Genesis 50, verse 24, he told his brothers, God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. In other words, he was not merely stating his opinion. His statement that God will surely reflects his absolute belief and trust in God, based on the fact that this was what he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There could be no greater assurance than that. And again, that shows his great faith. I mean, he has implicit trust in God, that God is faithful and will keep his word. And that is why, since Hebrews 11 is all about faith and examples of enduring faith, that is the one great example from Joseph that is recorded. Now, this should speak to us and encourage us to place our undying faith and trust in God's word. Now, the next part of Hebrews 11 concerns Moses. And beginning at verses 23 through 29, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. Now, these examples of faith involve, of course, Moses' parents and Moses himself. The Pharaoh, as you may recall, had decreed that all Hebrew newborn sons were to be cast into the Nile River and drowned. But Moses' parents hid him for 3 months because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, this is an example of faith overcoming the fear of man. And see, God undoubtedly had spoken to Moses' parents and told them to hide the child, because had the parents hidden the child simply because he was beautiful and because of their love and affection for him, their fear would have increased. However, because their faith and trust was in God, they were not afraid of the king's edict. As we have seen, faith enables us to overcome the will of the flesh and the will of man, and overcome the fear of man. Now, the faith of Moses himself is commended for 2 sets of events. Number 1, events before his call by God to set God's people free, and events after his call by God to set God's people free. Now, regarding the events before his call, it says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Now, the events stated there are found in Exodus chapter 2. And just as faith can overcome the fear of man, these verses show us that faith can overcome the praise of man and the pleasure, power, position, and riches that man has to offer. In rejecting that pleasure, power, position, and riches of Egypt for the ill treatment with the people of God, Moses was choosing that which he knew was better. He knew that choosing God, having faith in God, and rejecting the world, Egypt, and going with the people of God is far more valuable and important than the passing pleasures of sin. And as was with respect to the events after God called Moses to set his people free, verses 27 through 29 say, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. Now, as was true with Moses' parents, faith enabled Moses to overcome fear of the wrath of the king. Now, many people believe that Moses' fleeing from the king, or from the Pharaoh, was when he left Egypt after he killed the Egyptian who had been beating a Hebrew. However, I don't think that's true, because in Exodus 2, verse 14, it says, when he fled after killing the Egyptian, it says, then Moses was afraid and said, surely the matter will become known. And Exodus 2, verse 15 says, Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh, who tried to kill Moses. But Hebrews 11:27 says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Now, although it is possible that God spoke to Moses at some point after he killed the Egyptian, before he left Egypt, that is not stated in the Old Testament. And therefore, his leaving Egypt here in Hebrews 11:27 likely is referring to when Moses and the people left Egypt in the Exodus. And because, so Moses' first leaving Egypt after he killed the Egyptian was characterized by fear and fleeing, whereas his second leaving of Egypt was characterized by faith and leaving. And now, although verse 28 says that Moses kept the Passover, the word kept is poieo, which typically means to make or to do. In other words, in this sense, he instituted the Passover. And that instituting the Passover also indicates Moses' great faith. Why? Because it was on the very night that the Passover was instituted that Israel left Egypt. And Moses' faith is demonstrated by the fact that he had to explain to the people of Israel all the detailed requirements of how the Passover was to be kept, even though such matters may not have made any sense to the people, and even though the people were probably far more concerned about preparing to leave rather than perform various religious rituals. Faith is also seen in that it is not obvious why putting blood on the lintels and doorposts would cause the angel of death to pass over the house. And when the people were in the Red Sea, the idea that they could escape from Pharaoh's army was contrary to what they could see with their own eyes. In all these matters, Moses and the people were walking by faith and not by sight. And the last example that we will look at here in this lecture, is found in verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. In verse 31, by faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Now, so what we're talking about in these examples in this lecture, it's the events before Israel entered the land, then as they begin to enter the promised land. Now Joshua's plan, when it says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days, Joshua's plan for encircling the city of Jericho and its walls falling down on the 7th day appears in Joshua chapter 6. This plan would have required a great deal of faith on the part of Joshua and the Israelite army, since it was unprecedented and contrary to every other military campaign against any city by any army, Israelite or otherwise. Also, there was no obvious reason why marching around a city for 7 days and then blowing trumpets and shouting should cause the city's walls to fall down. The only basis for the success of this plan was that the Lord had given it to Joshua, and Joshua and his army believed and obeyed the Lord. Now, the account of Rahab's sheltering the Israelite spies is found in Joshua chapter 2. And in Joshua 2, verse 11, she testified, the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Her actions in protecting the Israelite spies were done by faith, as Hebrews 11:31 says. The inclusion of Rahab in the hall of faith is important in that she was neither from Israel, nor was she an Israelite. She was a Gentile from Jericho and a prostitute. And this is telling us, among other things, that people of every background can have faith. And the scarlet thread which she tied in her windows to identify her house to the Israelites has an association with the original Passover in Egypt, because their blood was placed on the lintels and the doorposts, and all who were inside were protected from the angel of death. Here, the scarlet thread was put in the window to serve as the sign that protected all of Rahab and her family in the house. And again, that also indicates that those protected were not limited to Jews, but both Jews and Gentiles are protected ultimately by the blood of Christ. Rahab herself, of course, is a pointer to Christ, to the gospel, and to the church, because as a Canaanite from Jericho, she is a foreshadow of the church, which consists of people, as Revelation 5 verse 9 says, from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And just as Gentiles became part of the church early on, so Rahab was a resident of Jericho, the first city taken by the Israelites after they crossed the Jordan River. And in Matthew 1, verses 4 and 5, it says that Rahab was the mother of Boaz through Salmon, and thus is part of the line that led to Jesus Christ. Hence, think about it. Canaanite blood flowed in the veins of Jesus. So these examples from before Israel entered the land, then in the Exodus, and then right when they entered the land, show in various ways how faith is manifested. And that word manifested is important because faith is not simply believing something up here. We demonstrate our faith by what we do. Do we obey God? Even when things don't make any sense to us, do we have trust in him? And when we do that, as these examples show, people of all backgrounds can be brought in to the family of God. I mean, Abraham was called by God when he was a pagan idolater in Mesopotamia. Moses, he's called by God as a murderer, even though he was an Israelite. And Rahab is called by God, even though she is a Gentile from Jericho and a prostitute. God is much bigger than we are, and his grace is much greater than whatever sins we have done. In the next lecture, we will conclude chapter 11 with other examples, and then we'll conclude that lecture with the very beginning of chapter 12, which sort of rounds off the whole discussion in chapter 11.